Hello, my name is Ainhoa, and I am a PhD candidate at the University of the Basque Country within the Department of Philosophy of Science. I would like to speak today within the framework of this virtual conference on about menstrual cycles and how they interfere, regulate, or impact emotions, as well as how birth control may have an impact on how the regulation happens. I have titled this presentation Emotional Numbness, but as you will see, there is much more to talk about how menstrual cycles make menstruating bodies a very specific subject that are worthy of philosophical research and reflection. So without further ado, let's start speaking about how menstruating bodies have been defined within a paradox. Now, what kind of paradox are we talking about? Menstruating bodies have been ignored in scientific and social institutions, yet this ill-fitting attention has not kept society from prescribing menstruating bodies, engraving in a society of a clear definition of what it is to be seen and what it is to remain hidden. The phenomenon of menstruation has evolved into an event that needs to be addressed, but through euphemisms, like it couldn't be spoken about openly. Science conducted on menstruating bodies has actually been criticized because of drawing erroneous analogies between menstruating organisms and organisms that do not menstruate at all. This is due to scientific knowledge on menstruating cycles being based almost in its entirety on studies on animals that do not experience a menstrual flow. A science about the menstrual cycle was developed following observations made on subjects that did not experience menstrual cycles. Scientific practice established concepts of normality and disorder that did not accurately reflect the experience of menstruating bodies. Some feminist scholars have denounced this tendency of scientific discourse to present norms associated with male bodies as universal. So not only we are researching on subjects that do not have a menstrual flow at all, but we are researching about those that do not even share the organs to have a menstrual cycle. The gendered address of science has obviously created some challenges that scholars like Foxkeller, Harding, and Haraway have addressed. Foxkeller, for example, prompted the review of scientific production, focusing on the elements that had been left out when defining the subject of scientific inquiry. Harding, on another note, theorized over the methodological tools used to create this scientific discourse. Clearly, the shadow of a dominant and confounding sense of objectivity led her to inquire about how the standpoint of the scientist could affect the trustworthiness of the discourse. This was further evolved by Haraway in her interpretation of the idea of situated knowledge. This concept underlined the embodiment of scientific production intertwined in a network of historically determined meanings. Scientific practice conducted from situated standpoints resulted into specific technologies and social orders. Objectivity is indeed not a universal, it's nothing but an illusion, according to her, of course. So this brings us into a problem of lack of knowledge, lack of visibility that could be just that, but it can have further consequences. In fact, if we speak about how lack of knowledge impacts in the way we process and understand the world, we could be speaking about a sort of epistemic injustice. For Fricker, the key to incorporating knowledge that has been excluded due to a gap in hermeneutical resources will be of bringing that to the topic. Now, what do we mean exactly when we speak about epistemic injustice? Hermeneutically marginalized subjects are prevented from participating in an activity of sense-making, of understanding, and of generating new meanings, making sense of not only what the world around them shows, but also of their own emotions. Systemically exercised hermeneutical inequality or epistemic injustice can lead to the establishment of a structurally prejudicial social group. Hermeneutical injustice involves an asymmetrical cognitive disadvantage, a situation where a subject or group is made unable to make sense and communicate an experience. This was further developed by De Jager and De Paolo, as well as Fuchs. Mutual incorporation in this sense will be what is brought when epistemic injustice doesn't happen, and when the lived experience of each of the participants corresponds to the reciprocal coordination of the factors that enable that embodiment with their bodies, their emotions, their world, etc., and allows for that kind of synchronization that enables understanding. Mutual incorporation prompts subjects to acknowledge divergences. It allows them to take part on the same conversation, and this can allow for non-dominant narrative to perdure, to start being spoken, and that's exactly what happens when we bring marginalized topics such as that of menstruation to light. But to what extent are we speaking of menstrual cycles as a taboo topic, as something that we don't want to talk about? Menstruating bodies, unfortunately, have become an absent reference. They must undergo a process through which they are objectified, they are fragmented, and they are consumed, or if I may, they become consumers. Several philosophers have underlined the role objectification in the establishment of social control over menstruating bodies has had. This objectification facilitates the fragmentation of the whole in its parts, and once reduced to parts, scientific production prompts the institutionalization of those parts into patriarchal values, or according to patriarchal values. For menstruating bodies, this fragmentation has led to the reference of menstruating bodies as if they were just menstruation. Menstruating bodies have been a historical target of superstition. Alien to the body that established that norm, they have been depicted as a threat, as an illness, as an unknown mystical element that has to be hidden, kept out of sight. Such taboos have succeeded at extending to everyday vocabulary, shaping and compromising how this phenomenon is thought, talked about, and shared. These biases have resulted in the general understanding that having a menstruating body is wrong and unhygienic. For menstruating bodies to fit the norm, they must deny a process inherently connected to their physiology. Failing to do so brings the risk of being discovered. But a biased vocabulary should not be mistaken by lack of vocabulary. We are drawn back to a similar paradox. Whilst menstruating is not spoken, its management is part of our everyday conversations. And as a result, menstruating bodies are expected an excellent management of a hygienic phenomenon, allowing them to remain clean. Menstruating bodies are in a constant surveillance, not necessarily by others, but by themselves, making sure that menstruation remains hidden, that they are not discovered. For that, they must always be ready for concealment, with a collection of menstrual products or technologies being the only warranty for such concealment. There is, however, an effect that is had from the lack of information and but abundance of menstrual technologies, and that's something that we can see already in a cyber manifesto by Haraway, where she speaks of the engineered network of technologies prompting the transformation of reproduction into a medical situation, where boundaries are subject to observation, assessment, and more importantly, intervention. Haraway defined the nature of these technologies as predatory, shaping cultural expectations of specific bodies, exercising control over the relations said bodies have with their own reproduction. For Haraway, these technologies have translated into highly technological environments for bodies that must disappear on cue, as well as their emotions, as well as the standpoint that we discussed earlier with Foxkeller, Harding, etc. A high-tech environment involves the removal of what is heterogeneous, and that, through its technological intervention, can be reassembled into an element that is measurable, quantifiable, and most importantly, equal to the established norm. Socially reproduced, these technologies become part of our bodies. Following Haraway's thoughts, menstrual technologies seem to have become inherent to menstruating bodies, designed to avoid the clear heterogeneity against the norm. And this does not only affect bodies physically, but also mentally and emotionally. The wider utilization of menstrual management technologies used with the main aim of concealing it are accompanied by a myriad of practices that menstruating bodies believe inherent to their physiology. These practices often have negative consequences on their well-being, leading them to an obsessive performance of self-policing. Self-policing include the practices of self-silencing, self-surveillance, and self-blaming. Since monarchy, menstruating bodies are taught menstruation is shameful, dirty, and polluting, condemned to be a phenomenon lived in secrecy and often in suffering. In the fear of being exposed, menstruating bodies become hyper-vigilant of their own bodies, convinced that they must have at all times their bodies under control. This obviously has an impact on their emotions and in the way that they are allowing themselves to feel and experience the world around them. Menstruating bodies grow terrified of the possibility of menstrual leaks, both physical and again emotional, of showing those feelings that may come with their menstruation, with the way their emotions change throughout their cycle. Not only do menstruating bodies monitor their bodies, but they also count on the collaboration of other menstruating bodies that share such fear and reassure the menstruated that all remains under control. It is oppression that is collectively exercised. But these are not the only ways in which we have medicalized and controlled, almost institutionalized menstruation. It's not that we have deemed menstruation as something undesirable or uncomfortable. There is an extra layer to the process of objectification and erasure of menstruating reference, that of actually suppressing menstruation and suppressing everything that may come with it. And for that, institutions have to develop the argument that menstruating bodies were better off if they did not menstruate at all. And that brings us to the question whether we want to erase everything that comes with it, as well as the way that we feel and experience that menstruating phenomenon. Medicalizing menstruation was just furthering an intuition that was present in clinical practice. For example, blood was thought to be dangerous for menstruating bodies, and managed through cloth pads, scientists believed blood could be reabsorbed, hence disposable pads. So just to have a thought about that idea of menstruating as something that is not quite right. It was actually by the end of the 90s that menstruation was linked to breast cancer and a higher incidence of breast cancer. In fact, it was explained that the higher amount of populations that women undergo currently compared to those women from previous generations, pre-industrial generations, meant that menstruating bodies currently are more exposed to ovulation, leading to a higher hormonal exposure that will then, of course, lead to a higher incidence or a higher possibility of developing breast cancer, which at the moment is not fully proven or endorsed. There are other factors that have to do with that incidence of breast cancer. But when we speak of birth control and menstrual control, to what extent are menstruating bodies controlled by these practices? And something that is quite clear is that with birth control, science allowed society to see the end of something that they consider bothersome. Continuous oral contraception is promoted long-term, inviting menstruators to regain their freedom and suppress a phenomenon that clearly disgusts others. This does not come without consequences and contributes to the menstrual stigma. In 2019, so it's 2022, in 2019, 248 million people in the world use hormonal birth control, These contraceptive methods, commonly referred to as the pill, are taken 21 to 28 days and are meant to stop ovarian cycling, alter the endometrial cycle, and prevent the cervical changes needed for fertility. When we look at the effect of contraceptive methods, they go much further than reproduction. In fact, menstruating bodies are often prescribed birth control with little to no information about what it does, describing the role of these treatments as regulatory or even a fix. Birth control, in contrast, shuts down completely the reproductive function in menstruating bodies, suppressing natural hormone secretion and exposing menstruating bodies to an artificial hormonal cadence. Conceiving birth control as the key to hiding menstruation, the concealment method itself has also become taboo, preventing the conversation on the side effects of long-term hormonal contraception. If these hormones at any point, which is something that is being researched and has had quite successful outcomes, if hormonal production had a say on the way that menstruating bodies experience the world and experience their own body, we can see here that the normal hormonal production changes quite remarkably when we take oral birth control, or even further when we take non-hormonal or progesterone only, birth control. If we were at any point hesitant to recognize this institutional control menstruating bodies undergone, menstruators with disabilities are often subject of non-consensual menstrual suppression due to them being thought as incapable of concealing their menstruation and therefore adhering to what is correct. Whilst doctors often argue that this is done with their safety in mind, scholars in menstrual studies believe that this is due to the visibility of the blood. Our menstruation is a complex process that involves sophisticated conversations between a wide variety of organs beyond the ovaries, to the point that, it will also affect our brains. These interactions have a role in functions other than reproduction, helping modulate cardiovascular, skeletal, muscular, respiratory, immunological functions, as well as our neuromodulation. Its complexity and undeniable relevance in the physiology of menstruating bodies should be recognized and, most importantly, socially endorsed, allowing for menstruating bodies to learn about their bodies freely. For that, self-knowledge must be supported, providing menstruators from their menarche with the tools and vocabulary to understand menstruations. As such, technology should not be something incompatible with menstruation, rather different. Technologies could be useful to contribute to that self-knowledge and now allowing menstruating bodies to decide whether they want to intervene in their periods or, in contrast, whether they would like to freely menstruate. And this is something that we can see here on the right-hand side of the screen, where we can see all these different ways and resources in which we can bring the idea of the conversation back about menstrual cycles. As you can see, there is a lot to speak and a lot to research about menstrual cycles and how they impact the way that we experience, not only physically again, but also mentally and emotionally, our world, as well as our own self-perception. Thinking that through birth control, the only key that we are playing is that of reproduction is a rather naive position, and we need to realize that it has consequences further than just simply ovarian function. Please do let me know if you have any questions. You can see there on the screen both my email addresses. You are more than welcome to contact me through either of them, and I will be looking forward to hearing back from you.